Welcome back to the channel. Last time we finished building the first tier of our retaining wall, and today we're going to stain it and then potentially do whatever else depending on how much footage I have. So let's get right into it. Alright, so the next things that we're going to be doing are staining this and then adding the gravel backfill so that we have proper drainage behind our retaining wall and so it doesn't fall down again because I don't want to ever have to do this a second time. But after doing the math on the amount of gravel that I would need, I realized that the only place to put it would be here where I put the rest of these timbers. Which brings us to step one of this equation, moving all those to the backyard to free up some space for the gravel, and that would at least allow me to get it on order knowing that I was absolutely going to pay for delivery. And with the wood pile successfully moved, we were now ready to begin staining. Now, like I said, this was another summer that was raining pretty heavily on and off, so I had to try to pick a day where we had 2 to 3 consecutive days that didn't have rain, and that on its own was a challenge. But that gave me plenty of time to plan out a few things. The first of which being how I was actually going to apply all of it. I decided to use this spray gun because I'm covering roughly 90 linear feet of wall that's somewhere around 3 foot high on average. Beyond that, these are landscaping timbers, they're all rough cut. As I figured out when I was staining the edges of these, trying to get the brush into all those little intricate details within the roughness of the wood, that's very time consuming when I could just spray over the top of it and be done very quickly. And to be honest, I think brushing or rolling on stain gives you a much longer lasting result because you're pressing it into the wood grain, but the amount of time I save by using the sprayer allows me to do this 2 or 3 times before I break even on labor. So the sprayer is what we're doing. And with that executive decision made, I began to prep the wall. I've got this coarse brush left over from another project. I used that to get the bulk of the dust and dirt out of this rough surface, and then I started laying down cardboard around the entire perimeter as a masking material. And the purpose of this is not to give me a nice sharp edge at the bottom of the wall, it's really just to add some sort of protection so that when I inevitably spill this or overspray it, that I don't have a permanently red sidewalk. But to block the gap between the cardboard and that bottom edge, I am going to use this other smaller piece of cardboard in my hand as I'm spraying along. You'll also see later that I'm going to try to mask off the rest of this with some newspaper tucked underneath the wall, but really using this piece of cardboard as a shield is going to be the biggest factor in preventing overspray. But with that, we are ready to start mixing this stain and getting it into the spray gun. Now I am going to be thinning this stain out. This spray gun is not designed to handle this stain at full thickness, and beyond that, thinning it out allows the same amount of stain to cover a much larger area, making the project less expensive, making it a total win-win. Now that said, I don't know exactly how dark the thinned out stain is going to come out relative to the other parts that I already covered with the brush. I did not thin out any of those sections that I applied to those end cuts, so I was worried that those would come out darker than the thinned out stain. For that reason, I decided to do my test spray on the inside top edge of that wall. The reason being, most of that's going to get covered by the gravel, so if it's not a perfect match, it's not too critical, but we are still going to have to stain that section because otherwise the entire backside of that top lip will be a very noticeable different color. And once the gravel's in, the only way to restain that area would be to dig all the gravel back out, and I obviously don't want to rework this unless I absolutely need to. And jumping to the after results, you can see that this thin spray was a lot lighter than what we applied before. All this means is I have to adjust my ratio of thinner to stain. I'll have to add more stain to give it a darker tone. But the other things I had to figure out while doing this trial were how fast that spray gun could actually spray the material, as well as the ideal distance for how far back the nozzle should be while I'm applying the stain. I figured out a lot of information in a very short amount of time by spraying it on the back surface, so making that call was probably one of the smarter decisions I've made while building this retaining wall. The 2 biggest lessons I learned is that if you sit in the same spot for too long, much like when you're spray painting, this will start to pool and run, and I tested out if I could quickly spread that using a paintbrush to try to blend it in better, which was a pretty effective solution for this. But what I didn't expect was the amount of stain that built up on that piece of cardboard that I was holding to prevent overspray. That caught enough overspray to actually start dripping, so it's a very good thing I put all this cardboard down. But I also figured out that if I held it too close to the back wall and I actually made contact with that front corner is coarse enough to scrape all of the stain off of that piece of cardboard. So I actually had a few places here where you can see some pretty substantial stain buildup from touching that cardboard to that front edge. Fortunately, that is not a huge deal here, but I will have to be mindful about that when I'm spraying the front of the wall so I don't have too much stain buildup on the top. And with those lessons learned, I now felt ready to spray the face of this wall. And as you can tell with the spray gun, this went real quick. And I gotta say, I do a lot of time-lapse videos for my projects, but there is nothing as satisfying to me as watching something get painted or stained. Oh my god, I don't know what it is, it just scratches that itch for me. But anyhow, in the first section of this, I was getting a little bit of overspray on the bottom, so you'll see on this other section where I had the new footing and I was a little bit more concerned because I can see this more easily when I first walk out to my backyard. I decided to use a little bit more caution, and that's where I started tucking the newspaper into the bottom of these below that bottom board. Not to say the first section necessarily was bad, I just thought I could do a better job, and this seemed like some really easy insurance. And overall, this was relatively quick and easy, which is a shocker on one of my projects, so let's go into some things that maybe didn't go as well as I had hoped they would. First is that the color doesn't appear uniform across the entire thing. It does look like there's a little bit of blotchiness, and granted this still has to dry, but I do think that was from a little bit of uneven coating as this was going on. What I discovered while I was spraying this is that this gun, being a cheaper and older unit, was not very consistent with the amount of material it pumped out at once. There was definitely times where it was spraying noticeably faster or noticeably slower, and I don't know if that's because the nozzle was either dirty or partially clogged. The other thing is, as this paint hopper got more empty, the pickup tube is only in one location. That means I had to hold the spray gun at a very specific angle for the stain to actually get sprayed out. Otherwise, the pickup tube was not in the puddle of stain that was remaining. Like I said earlier, I did get some overspray onto the concrete pad before I put some of that newspaper down. You can see that here, but this is relatively minor. By comparison, here's the area that I masked off, a couple really tiny bleed areas, but overall the newspaper did its job and caught the majority of the drips and overspray. And while all of those end cuts that I brush stained are a little bit darker and you can see them here, it's not as bad of a contrast as I thought it was going to be, so I think it's going to be okay once this dries out. So let's come back after this has had about 24 hours to dry in the summer heat. Quick footnote though, dry is a relative term because if you've ever painted anything outside, you know that the second you finish, the skies are going to look like this. Because apparently 0% chance of rain means clouds only directly above my house and nowhere else. Looking on the bright side though, the skies didn't open up. This did get a pretty good chance to dry out before it really got wet. And that is a major crisis averted, so let's jump to the next day. So here it is, the big reveal, the final result with the stain dried. That's actually not bad. I'm happy with that. Considering I've never used a spray gun before, I think this actually came out pretty good. I was not really expecting much of myself, and I think this came out much better than I expected after seeing that test on the backside of the wall. I think the biggest difference too now that this is dry is a lot of that blotchiness from when I first applied it is gone. Some of that was from the stain still being wet, but because these timbers have been sitting in the sun, they've gotten different amounts of sun exposure. Between the grain structure and the difference in sun exposure, they basically sucked in that stain at different rates. So while I was having some sprayer issues, the actual root cause of the problem was this grain structure. But that's a good place to close this one out, so I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.